In a small apartment that smelled of old paper and brewing tea, sound was everything. It was the sun that woke 19-year-old Alara not through a window, but through the soft rhythm of rain against the glass, each drop a tiny, distinct note. It was the map she used to navigate her world. The gentle hum of the refrigerator telling her she was in the kitchen. The specific creak of the third floorboard in the hallway, a warning sign. But more than anything, sound was her sight. It was the way she saw the world's colors, felt its textures, and understood its deepest emotions. And at the center of her world was the old, upright piano, a gift from a community fund years ago, which now stood as the steady, beating heart of her small home. Her fingers knew the ivory keys better than they knew the lines of her own palm. They didn't just press them, they conversed with them. When she played, she wasn't just reading notes from memory or reproducing a piece she had heard. She was translating a feeling. A low, rumbling chord would vibrate up through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet. A deep and reassuring hum that she felt as a dark, warm color, like rich earth. A cascade of high, tinkling notes was a shower of cool, silver light against her skin. Music, for Alara, was a tapestry woven from threads of vibration and resonance. A world so real and vivid that the one she couldn't see sometimes felt like the dream. Her gift was a local wonder. At the small community center down the street, people would gather to listen. Their hushed breathing and soft sighs part of the performance. They didn't see a blind girl who had learned to play by ear. They heard a storyteller who could make the piano weep or laugh with a startling honesty. Her teacher, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Anton, saw in her something more than just talent. He saw a raw, untamable force, a connection to the music that went far beyond technical skill. He had spent years nurturing her, not by forcing Braille scores on her, but by playing for her, by describing the stories behind the compositions, and by letting her incredible memory and emotional intuition do the rest. He knew she was special, a rare bloom in a world that often prized uniform perfection. One afternoon, Mr. Anton came to her apartment with a newspaper in his hand and a nervous energy he couldn't hide. He told her about the master class being held at the city's most prestigious conservatory. The guest of honor was a man whose name was spoken in whispers of awe and fear, Maestro Julian. He was a titan in the world of classical music, a legend whose records had sold millions, and whose critiques could make or destroy a young career. He was known for his technical brilliance, his unforgiving ear, and his deep-seated belief that true mastery of the piano came from one thing above all else: total observation. To him, a musician had to see the score, see their hands, see the way the hammer struck the string. It was a science as much as an art. Alara listened quietly, her hands resting in her lap. The idea of playing for a man like that was terrifying. "He wouldn't be interested in me," she said softly. "I don't play his way." Mr. Anton shifted his weight. "That's exactly why you must play for him," he insisted, his voice firmer than she had ever heard it. "The world needs to hear this, Alara, not just the neighborhood. The world." Without telling her, he had already sent in a recording. It was a simple, digital tape of Alara playing a notoriously difficult Chopin etude, a piece she had learned by listening to a dozen different versions and then creating her own interpretation. He sent it with a small note, hoping, against all odds, that the maestro might listen. Meanwhile, in a grand, minimalist study overlooking the sprawling city, Julian Vance was growing tired. He sat at his desk, surrounded by leather-bound scores and gleaming awards, listening to one audition tape after another. They were all technically brilliant, perfect, flawless, and soul-crushingly boring. Each performance was a perfect photograph of a masterpiece, but none of them were alive. He heard precision, but no passion. He heard discipline, but no depth. He was about to call it a day when a new file began to play. The audio quality wasn't perfect. It sounded like a simple home recording. But then the music started. It was the Chopin etude, but it was different. There was a fire to it, a raw, almost desperate emotion that snagged his attention. It was messy, imperfect, but it was alive. He leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Then he heard it. A slight hesitation, a fraction of a second, where her interpretation deviated from the score. To him, it was a flaw, a sign of undisciplined feeling. He sighed. The interest gone as quickly as it had come. He glanced at the application form attached to the audio file. The notes said the pianist was a young woman who had been blind since birth. He shook his head slowly. Of course. Sentimental, he muttered to himself. How can one possibly play what one cannot see? The instrument, the sheet music, the physics of the sound? It is an impossibility. He dismissed the tape, placing it in a digital pile of rejections. A few days later, journalists from a major arts publication interviewed him about the upcoming masterclass. "Maestro," the reporter asked, "what do you think is the most important quality for a young musician to possess today?" Vance, sitting stiffly in a high-backed chair, saw his opening. "Passion is a given, but it is useless without discipline," he said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "True mastery requires total observation. You must see the music, feel the instrument, understand the mechanics. Anything else is just guessing." The quote was printed the next day. To most, it was just a grumpy old master being a purist. But when Mr. Anton read it to Alara, she heard it for what it was, a public dismissal of her entire existence as a musician. He was calling her a fraud without even knowing her name. A heavy silence fell over the apartment. Alara's face, usually so expressive, was a mask of stillness. Mr. Anton watched her, his heart aching for her. He had meant to give her a chance, not to subject her to a public humiliation. "I am so sorry, Alara," he whispered. "I never should have." But she wasn't listening to his apology. She was replaying the maestro's words in her mind, feeling the weight of them. It wasn't just a critique. It was a judgment. Her world, the one she saw through sound and vibration, had been deemed invalid by the most powerful man in her universe. She thought of all the hours she had spent at the piano, of the joy and solace it had brought her. She thought of the ways she could make a whole room full of people feel a single, shared emotion. Was that all just guessing? A strange, quiet resolve began to form within her. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't a desire for revenge. It was something deeper. It was a need to stand up and say, "I am here. My world is real." She turned her head towards her teacher, her sightless eyes finding his. "Mr. Anton," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is there still a spot in that master class?" He hesitated, then nodded. A late cancellation had opened one place. "Tell them," she said, her hands already finding their way to the keys of her piano, "that I will be there." She would walk into that grand hall, into the lion's den, not with a shield of anger, but with the only weapon she had ever needed, her truth spoken through the language of music. The conservatory's concert hall was a place built for silence. It was a grand, hollowed-out space where even the smallest cough sounded like a shout. The air itself felt heavy, thick with expectation and the collective nervous energy of 200 hopeful students sitting in the audience. They were all there to watch and learn, to witness the maestro at work. Every eye, it seemed, was fixed on the single chair on the vast, empty stage, waiting for Julian Vance to appear. He entered not from the wings, but from a side door near the front, a small, sharp figure moving with a quiet authority that silenced the last few whispers. He didn't smile or wave. He simply walked to his chair, sat, and let his gaze sweep across the room, making every person feel as if they were being personally inspected and found wanting. Ilara waited in a small, sterile room backstage. The air was cool and smelled of old wood and something like antiseptic. A young staff member, whose name she didn't catch, led her to a chair. She could hear the distant, muffled sounds of the hall settling, the rustle of programs, the soft thud of a closing door. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm that was entirely hers and yet felt out of her control. She had played for people before, for neighbors, for small, appreciative crowds. But this was different. This was a courtroom, and she was the only one on trial. She ran her fingers over the worn cotton of her dress, a simple dark blue one that Mr. Anton had helped her pick out. It felt like armor, but it was very thin armor. Then, a voice cut through the quiet from the stage, amplified by the speakers. It was Vance's voice, sharper and colder in person than it had been in her imagination. "We will begin," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Our first participant is Ilara. Please come to the stage." The name hung in the air for a moment, a single, isolated note. She felt a hand gently touch her shoulder, the same staff member. "I'll guide you," the girl whispered, her voice kind. Ilara nodded and stood, her legs feeling stiff and foreign. As she was led across the backstage area and up the short steps onto the stage, the world shrank to the sound of her own footsteps on the wooden planks and the girl's quiet breathing beside her. The moment she stepped into the light of the stage, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't a warm light, but a cool, focused one that seemed to press down on her. She could feel the immense emptiness of the space around her, the vast, dark sea of the audience. The air was still, so still that she could feel a slight draft from the ceiling vents brushing against her cheek. She was led to the piano. The staff member tapped the wood of the bench. "Here you are." Ilara reached out, her fingers finding the familiar, cool wood of the polished Steinway. She slid onto the bench, her feet finding the pedals. The instrument felt like an old friend in a strange and threatening land. Single point of connection in a dizzying void. She could feel Vance's presence across the stage. It wasn't something she saw, but something she sensed, a still point of intense energy. She didn't need to be told he was watching her. She could feel his judgment like a physical pressure. He didn't offer a word of welcome. He addressed the room, his voice echoing slightly in the high ceiling. "We will hear the Chopin Etude, Opus 10, Number 4, he announced. "A piece that demands absolute control. A test of both the hands and the eyes." He let the word eyes hang in the air, a clear, deliberate message to the audience. He wasn't just listening to a performance. He was making a point. Ilara placed her fingers on the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, feeling the cool ivory under her fingertips. She tried to push the fear away, to ignore the weight of the maestro's stare and the silent judgment of the crowd. She thought of her small apartment, the smell of tea, the gentle rain on the window. She thought of the music as a friend, as a part of herself. She took a slow, deep breath, and then she began to play. The first notes were sharp and clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. The etude was a whirlwind of sound, a torrent of fast, intricate passages that required incredible speed and precision. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion she could feel in the muscles of her forearms. In the audience, a few people leaned forward. It was impressive, undeniably so. But it wasn't perfect. It wasn't the sterile, flawless execution they were used to hearing from competition winners. There was a roughness to it, an urgency. It was as if she wasn't just playing the notes, but was wrestling with them, trying to pull a story from their complex shapes. As she played, she began to lose herself in the music, as she always did. She was no longer on a stage, under a spotlight. She was inside the piece, feeling its turmoil, its fleeting moments of beauty, its deep melancholic sighs. Her playing became more daring, more personal. She held a note a fraction of a second longer than was written, letting it hang in the air, full of longing. She attacked a difficult run, not with cold precision, but with a fiery passion that made it sound almost desperate. The audience, which had been prepared to critique, found itself being pulled in. They stopped listening for mistakes and started listening for the story. It was a raw, honest performance, full of vulnerability and power. A woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, moved by a kind of sadness she had never heard in the piece before, but on the other side of the piano. Julian Vance sat with his arms crossed, his face a mask of unreadable stone. He was not moved. He was dissecting. He heard the extra-long note and saw it as a technical error, a failure of timing. He heard the passionate attack and dismissed it as undisciplined showmanship. He was searching for the flaw, the definitive proof that his theory was correct, that this was all just sentimental nonsense. He believed in the purity of the score, the mathematical perfection of the composer's intent. What he was hearing, to him, was a distortion. Then it happened. In the middle of a particularly complex and rapid section, her fingers, moving so fast they felt like they were barely touching the keys, faltered. It was a small mistake, a single jarring note that broke the flow for just a heartbeat. To most in the audience, it was a tiny ripple in a powerful river, a moment of human fallibility that made the performance even more real. But to Vance, it was a crack in the dam. It was the proof. He leaned forward slightly, a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been triumph. He had found the weakness. He had been right, but as she recovered instantly, her fingers finding their place again with a resilience that was almost startling, he didn't feel the satisfaction he expected. Instead, he heard something else in the wake of that mistake. He heard the silence that followed it. In that tiny pause, a space had opened up, and in that space, there was an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just sadness or anger. It was a profound and breathtaking sense of loss, a feeling that she had been telling a story of a desperate struggle, and that one single misstep had been a moment of devastating defeat. And then, as she picked the thread back up and pushed forward, there was something else. Incredible courage. He had listened to thousands of pianists play this piece. He had heard them all play the notes perfectly. Not one of them had ever made him feel that the struggle was real. He, the master of control, was suddenly confronted with the power of beautiful, glorious imperfection. For the first time in a very long time, Julian Vance felt that he was the one who didn't understand. The final chord of the Chopin etude faded into the heavy silence of the concert hall. It was a silence that felt different from the one before. It was no longer empty or waiting. It was now full, thick with the ghost of the story Alara had just told. A few people in the audience let out a shaky breath they hadn't realized they were holding. No one clapped. It didn't feel like the right response. The performance hadn't been a show. It had been a confession. Alara sat very still on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers still trembling slightly from the exertion. She felt empty and exposed, as if she had just taken out her own heart and held it up for everyone to see. She waited for the verdict, the sharp public dismantling she had been bracing herself for. She could feel the maestro's presence, a coiled spring of energy across the stage, ready to strike. She expected to hear his voice, amplified and clinical, pointing out her technical flaws. But instead, she heard the creak of his leather armchair. He was standing up. A ripple of unease went through the audience. Was he leaving? Was the performance so offensive he couldn't even bring himself to critique it? Hilaire's heart sank. She had failed. Her small, honest world of music had been shattered against the cold, hard wall of his expertise. She kept her head bowed, her sightless eyes staring at her hands, preparing for the final crushing words. But the footsteps she heard were not walking away. They were coming towards her. They were slow, deliberate, each one a soft thud on the wooden stage floor. The sound grew closer and closer still, until she could feel the air shift as a person stopped right beside her. The scent of old wool and a faint clean cologne replaced the smell of the piano's varnish. It was him. Julian Vance was standing next to her. Alara felt a surge of panic. What was he doing? Was he going to tap her on the shoulder and dismiss her in front of everyone? He didn't touch her. He didn't speak to the room. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur that was meant only for her, a stark contrast to the public persona he had just displayed. "You play the notes," he said, his voice raspy, stripped of its earlier arrogance. Alara flinched slightly, bracing for the butt that was sure to come. "But you are not hearing the story the silence is telling." Lara froze. She didn't understand. Silence was just silence. It was the space between the sounds. Before she could process his strange words, she felt a presence beside her hand, which was still resting in her lap. He reached out, but his movements were not what she expected. He didn't grab her wrist or try to guide her fingers to the keys. Instead, he gently took her hand and, with an unexpected softness, pressed her palm flat against the polished wooden side of the piano just above the keyboard. His own hand, dry and surprisingly warm, rested on top of hers for a moment, then withdrew. "Feel that?" he asked, his voice still a private whisper against the backdrop of the silent hall. Alara focused her entire being on that small point of contact. All her fear and confusion faded, replaced by a deep, ingrained curiosity. She could always feel the vibrations of the strings through the keys and the pedals, but this was different. This was the wood itself. Yes, she whispered back, her voice barely audible. That is the heartbeat, he said. The rests are not empty. They are breaths. You have been running through the piece, trying to get to the next note. But the music lives in the spaces between. It was a revelation. It was as if he had just handed her a new sense, a new way to perceive the world she thought she knew so well. She had been listening to the words, but he was telling her to listen to the pauses, the places where the story was not spoken but felt. And then he did something that no one in that room would ever forget. He didn't tell her to play again. He didn't lecture her on theory. He began to sing. It wasn't a performance. It was a low, almost hesitant humming at first. A simple, melancholic melody that wove around the last few notes she had played. It was a phrase of music she had never heard before, a beautiful, sad counter-melody that seemed to be the voice of the silence he was talking about. A few people in the front rows leaned in, their eyes wide with disbelief. The great Julian Vance, the master of pristine, unemotional perfection, was humming a tune of his own creation on a public stage, as if sharing a secret. Can you hear that? He whispered again. This is what Chopin was afraid of. This is the thought he couldn't write down. Play it. Elaire's mind raced. She didn't know the notes. She had only heard his humming once. But she understood what he was asking. He wasn't testing her memory. He was asking her to translate a feeling. She lifted her shaking hands back to the keys. He hummed the phrase again, a little louder this time. And her fingers found the notes, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. The melody he sang was a dark, winding river, and the chords she played were the smooth stones on its bed. He wasn't teaching her. He was conversing with her in their shared language. A young man in the third row, who had been recording the masterclass on his phone for a school project, instinctively angled his device towards the stage. He didn't know why, but he felt he was witnessing something that was not meant for the 200 people in the room, but for the world. The small screen captured the unbelievable sight, the intimidating maestro, leaning over the blind girl, his head bowed near hers, singing softly as her hands brought his silent melody to life. The conversation between their two styles of music continued for what felt like both an eternity and a single, perfect moment. His humming was the question. Her playing was the answer. Then, as Alara finished the phrase he had given her, she did something that surprised even herself. She added a single high, soft note of her own at the end. A question back. Vance stopped humming. The hall was so silent you could have heard a pin drop. He stared at the top of her head, his expression unreadable. Then, a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, catching the light from the stage. He quickly brushed it away, but it was too late. Everyone in the first few rows had seen it. The great stone statue of a man had just cracked. When the last vibrations of Alara's note had died away, he spoke again, his voice low and thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. For 50 years, he said, his words for her alone, I have been a master of the piano. I have commanded it. I have controlled it. I have made it do what I wanted. Paused, and she could hear him swallow hard. He reached out again, but this time he took her hand properly, holding it in his own. Today you have reminded me what it means to be its servant. He squeezed her hand gently. Forgive me. The words were so quiet, so personal, but they hung in the air with the weight of 1,000 apologies. They were not just for her, but for every musician he had ever stifled with his rigid, unforgiving doctrine. In that moment, on a stage meant for judgment, a master had become a student, and a challenge had become a gift. The young man in the third row lowered his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he ended the recording. He knew, without a doubt, that he had just captured something extraordinary. The video was uploaded to a video-sharing website late that night by the young man, a student named Leo. He wasn't trying to become famous or start a movement. He just knew that what he had captured was too powerful to keep to himself. He titled it simply, Legendary Maestro Brought to Tears by Blind Pianist. He added no description, no commentary, just the raw, unedited, 4-minute clip. He sent the link to a few friends and then went to bed, thinking maybe a few hundred people would see it. He woke up the next morning to a world on fire. His phone was buzzing uncontrollably, flooded with notifications. The video hadn't been seen by a few hundred people. It had been seen by millions. The internet had done what the internet does. It had found a story and amplified it until it became a roar. Major news sites from dozens of countries were embedding the video on their home pages. With headlines shouting about the humbling of a titan and the heartbreaking lesson that moved the world, television producers were calling the conservatory, trying to find out the names of the girl and the maestro. The clip was being shared on every social media platform, each share carrying its own commentary. "This is why art matters," cried watching this, the maestro's face at the end. "I can't." In her small apartment, Ilara was completely overwhelmed. She and Mr. Anton had spent the night talking, processing the incredible events on that stage. They had no idea that a private, transformative moment was now a public spectacle. The first she knew of it was when her phone, a simple model with large buttons for easy use, began to ring with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. A kind-sounding woman from a national television station wanted to book her for a morning show. A man with a fast-talking voice from a famous record label wanted to discuss an album deal. They all wanted a piece of the story, a piece of her. Ilara, who craved only the quiet connection of music, was suddenly thrust into a world of noise, a world she couldn't see and couldn't navigate. The attention felt like a physical weight, pressing in on her from all sides. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This wasn't what she had wanted. She had only wanted to prove her world was real, and to become the center of someone else's. While Ilara was hiding from the ringing phone, Julian Vance was confronting a storm of his own making. The video had changed his life, too. The image of his tear-streaked face was now an iconic symbol of humility. But where many saw a beautiful moment, some in the old guard of classical music saw a disgrace. An old colleague called him, his voice dripping with condescension. To say that Vance had gone soft, that he had cheapened decades of rigorous discipline with a sentimental stunt. Vance listened to the criticism, but for the first time it didn't sting. He saw it for what it was, the same rigid, prideful thinking he had been guilty of his entire life. The criticism only strengthened his resolve. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, not just to Ilara, but to the truth he had been forced to see. He knew she was unequipped to handle the media frenzy, and he refused to let the world that had misjudged her now misinterpret her. He broke his own long-standing rule of giving no interviews and agreed to sit down with a respected arts journalist. The interview was broadcast live and was the event everyone was waiting for. The journalist started with the obvious question. "Maestro, the world saw you brought to tears. What happened in that moment?" Vance, sitting in the familiar comfort of his study, looked directly into the camera, his expression calm and open. "I was not brought to tears," he said, his voice steady. "I was woken up. For 50 years, I have been teaching people how to play the piano correctly. That young woman taught me how to listen to it. I heard her struggle, and I heard her courage, and I realized my own understanding of music was incomplete." He went further, sharing the philosophy that had led him to his dismissive attitude. "I believed music was an architecture to be built with perfect precision. She showed me it is also a landscape to be explored with your heart. She does not play with her hands. She plays with her entire being. Her blindness is not a deficit. It is her instrument. It is a gift." The interview sent a new wave of admiration through the public. People who had watched the video were now moved by his honesty. He wasn't just a legend anymore. He was a man who had learned a profound lesson and was brave enough to admit it. He immediately used his newfound public goodwill for a purpose. He called the director of the very conservatory where the masterclass had taken place. "That young woman," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "will be on a full scholarship, starting immediately. She will have the best teachers, the best resources. You will find a way." The director, caught up in the whirlwind of positive press, readily agreed. Then he made a personal call. He found Ilara's number through Mr. Anton. When she answered, her voice small and hesitant, he didn't give her time to be afraid. "Ilara," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "this is Julian Vance. We have some things to do, you and I." He arranged for a car to pick her up and bring her to his home, a grand, sprawling house she had only ever imagined. When she arrived, he didn't treat her like a celebrity. He treated her like a musician. He led her not to a grand salon with a priceless concert piano, but to a small, intimate practice room in the back of the house. The piano there was an older instrument, with a warm, mellow tone. "This is where the real work is done," he told her, "not on stages for applause." For the first few meetings, they barely played. He would describe paintings to her, not in terms of color, but in terms of texture and temperature. He would read poetry to her, focusing on the rhythm of the words. He was teaching her how to see with her other senses, how to find the stories in the silence he had spoken of on the stage. In turn, she taught him. She would play a simple melody, and she would describe to him the colors it created in her mind. "That low note is a deep, dark purple," she would say, "like velvet." He would sit and listen, his eyes closed, trying to see it too. He began to understand that her gift wasn't a parlor trick. It was a completely different, and in many ways deeper, form of perception. Their relationship deepened into a true mentorship. He was the structure, the discipline she needed to shape her immense talent. She was the inspiration, the reminder of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Their lessons became a collaboration, a dialogue between two different worlds of understanding, slowly finding a beautiful harmony in the middle. He was helping her build the vessel, and she was teaching him what it was meant to carry. Exactly 1 year later, the city's most famous concert hall was buzzing with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the quiet, nervous energy of a masterclass, but the eager, anticipatory hum of a sold-out charity event. The program was a celebration of musical legends, and the final performance was the one everyone had come to see. It was listed in the glossy program simply as Piano Duet, Julian Vance and Alara. Backstage, the air was filled with the scent of hairspray and expensive perfume. Musicians chatted in their dressing rooms, and stagehands called out instructions. In the quiet corner they had been given, Alara sat on a simple chair, her fingers tracing the patterns on the fabric of her gown. It wasn't a simple, dark blue dress this time. It was a deep, shimmering green, the color of a quiet forest at dusk. It was a gift from the maestro, who had described it to her as the color of deep listening. She felt a strange sense of calm. A year ago, this kind of stage would have terrified her. But now, it just felt like another room, a place where music could live. She'd spent countless hours with the maestro in his small practice room, and that room had taught her more than any grand stage ever could. She heard his familiar, measured footsteps approach. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, a steady, grounding presence. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice the same low, gentle tone he always used with her now. Alara smiled and nodded. "I think so. Are you?" He let out a soft, dry chuckle. "I have been waiting my whole life for this." He reached out and offered her his arm, a gesture that had become their ritual. It wasn't for guidance anymore. It was a partnership. "They are all out there," he said, his voice quieter. "They are here to see a phenomenon, a story. Let us give them something more." Together they walked onto the stage. The roar of the applause that met them was a physical force, a warm wave of sound that washed over Alara. It was a sound she had grown familiar with over the past year. But this time it felt different. It was deeper, fuller. She could feel the vibration of it through the soles of her shoes, up into her bones. He led her not to the piano where she would play alone, but to the center of the stage, in front of the magnificent concert grand. The piano was positioned so that they could sit side by side, a single bench for two people. As they sat down, the applause began to subside, settling into an attentive silence. The piece they were about to play was their creation. They had named it Conversation for Two Hands. It was not a traditional duet, with one person playing the treble and the other the bass. It was a true interweaving of their voices, their musical personalities. It was the story of their entire journey, put into sound. The maestro lifted his hands, and Alara felt the slight shift of his weight beside her, a silent signal. His hands began the piece, playing a theme that was classic, structured, and beautiful. It was his voice, the voice of discipline, of a lifetime of perfect intellectual control. The melody was like a grand stone building, strong and imposing. Ilara listened, her hands resting on the keys, feeling the vibrations of his theme. Then her fingers joined in. She didn't play the harmony. She played an echo of his theme, but softer, more fragile, like a reflection of his building in a pool of water. It was her voice, the voice of emotion, of intuition. The audience watched, completely captivated. The music was a conversation. He would play a strong, confident phrase, and she would answer with a questioning, tender one. He would play a rapid, complex passage, a show of his legendary technique, and she would respond with a simple, heartfelt melody that was more powerful than any display of speed. They were not just playing notes. They were talking to each other. There were moments of gentle agreement, where their hands played in such perfect harmony that it was impossible to tell who was playing which part. And there were moments of heated debate where the music became tense and discordant, their two themes clashing in a flurry of dissonant chords, only to resolve into a new, more beautiful understanding. A section in the middle of the piece was dedicated to the silences Vance had taught her about. The music would stop completely, leaving the hall in a profound, breathless void. Before one of them would start a new idea, as if speaking after a long, thoughtful pause, the emotional peak of the piece came near the end. The maestro played a version of the simple, melancholic melody he had hummed to her on that fateful day a year ago. It was the sound of his apology, of his awakening. As his notes hung in the air, Ilara's response was the same single, high, questioning note she had played back then. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was an answer. It was a note of acceptance, of forgiveness, of a new beginning. As she held that note, he began to play a supportive, rich harmony underneath it, lifting her up. No longer a master correcting a student, but a partner celebrating a peer. The music swelled from there, their two voices finally merging into one single, powerful, and incredibly moving statement of shared humanity. When the final chord was struck, they let the sound fade into silence. They didn't move. They sat there for a long moment, their hands still resting on the keys. The vibrations of the last notes humming through them like a shared pulse. It was their private moment in a public space, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them to this point. Then the concert hall erupted. The applause was no longer a wave. It was a tidal wave, a wall of sound so loud and full of love that it felt almost solid. People were standing, cheering, some were crying. The world had watched their story unfold online, but now they had been a part of it. Ilara and Vance stood up and turned to face the audience, bowing together. The applause only grew louder, but as they straightened up, Vance did something that was not in the program. He put a gentle hand on Ilara's back and guided her forward, away from him and toward the center of the stage, into the single, warmest spotlight. He took a step back, placing himself just at the edge of the light, in the soft shadows. He did not bow again. He simply stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, and he applauded. He was not clapping for the audience, or for himself. He was clapping for her. Ilara, now alone in the center of the vast, adoring hall, felt the full weight of that sound directed at her. But this time, it wasn't a weight. It was a gift. She thought back to the frightened girl in the backstage room a year ago, and she realized how far she had come. The viral video had not been the end of her story. It had been the opening note. The maestro's challenge had not been a trial to be endured. It had been an invitation to be heard. Her blindness was not a barrier. It was simply the window through which she saw a world that others were only just beginning to perceive. She took her own solo bow, a deep, graceful one, and as she straightened up, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. She was home.